All right. So the first question we'd like to start with is, how do you define action research?
Well, I define it a couple of ways. Real loosely, I just define it as practitioner research. And I think that for a lot of people, if people are familiar with research in general, they'll have a sense of what I mean by that. But for people who aren't that familiar with research, that tends to confuse them even more because they don't understand, they don't think that practitioners can do research. So the much more extended kind of definition really has to do with practitioners doing research in their own settings, investigating problems of practice that they identify, things that they want to try to fix, things that they want to try to improve, things that they want to try to change. We'll probably come back to this in some of the questions that we might talk about later, but one of the things that I always try to stress to people within the parameters of defining action research is to let them know that action research is not something that has to be a big, comprehensive kind of research study the way that a lot of people, graduate students and practitioners, tend to think of research. That it's a much bigger, much more comprehensive kind of research study with lots of data and takes lots and lots of time. And that may or may not be the case with action research. But one of the things that I try to incorporate into that definition is to let people know that that's not sort of a prerequisite. That's not a necessary component of action research. That it can be something that's very manageable for the practitioner to handle in sort of the framework of all the other things that they're doing in their full-time jobs as practitioners. So
Right. So why should practicing teachers engage in action research? What's the benefit for them and their students?
I think there are tons of benefits. I think that the benefits are really almost limitless. I sort of have a standard list that I talk about. One of the biggest ones, I think, is the fact that it's very empowering. I think that to a large degree, it puts practitioners at any level. And so, we could be talking about teachers, we could be talking about administrators, we could be talking about support personnel, we can be talking about individuals that are in probably less traditional educational settings. Any and all of them can conduct action research. But I think the thing that is so important to me is the fact that with the notion of becoming empowering is the fact that it puts them back in charge of a lot of these kinds of things that they're trying to solve and resolve, all related to the teaching and learning process. So engaging in these kinds of action research activities really sort of take out what used to be sort of the middle person in the process. You've got a problem and you want to solve it, and you went to your administrator and on and on and on. And I think the idea behind action research that is so important to me is the fact that it empowers practitioners to sort of take the lead and to be that kind of, take that sort of a leadership role in solving your own problems. And that's a huge factor for a lot of people. I think it adds a lot of professionalism back into the profession of being an educator that's been missing for some time, to be honest with you. Secondly, I think that it really fosters a sense of intellectual engagement. I think that it gives professional educators an opportunity to really talk about issues that they see in a collaborative manner with their colleagues, maybe with supervisors or superiors, but certainly with people at the same level. And teachers have done those kinds of things for decades. They've done that since the beginning of education in our country. But action research is a much more systematic way of doing that. It's a much more reflective way to do that. But I think that it really does tend to foster a lot of that intellectual engagement in the educational process. One of the other things that I think it does is that it epitomizes this idea of data-informed decision making. In the past 10 to 15 years, data-driven decision-making, data-informed decision-making, however you choose to look at that or call that, has really become a huge, huge issue in our schools all across the country. And we have this expectation that educators at all levels, again, classroom teachers, administrators, you name it, that these individuals have the ability and the capacity to collect data, to be able to analyze data and make sense of those data, but then use those data as a mechanism for enhancing the decision-making processes that we all engage in on a daily basis. And so I think by designing action research studies that really pinpoint and target and focus what individual educators want to look at and want to try to improve, it just streamlines that whole process so that now the data that we're collecting are data that makes sense for exactly what it is we want to look at. I think that I mentioned this earlier. I'll just highlight it again because it's such a big component of action research. But the concept of engaging in professional reflection. Mm-hmm. And again, as educators, we all do that, but we all do it to differing degrees. And I think the idea that built into the process of educational or in the process of action research is this concept of professional educational reflection. The fact that we're constantly looking at our practice, sort of questioning what we do and how we do it, not necessarily in a negative manner, not to say that we're always doing things that are wrong that need to be improved, because sometimes we'll find out that we're doing things that are working very well, and that doesn't need to be a focus of action research. And then the final thing that I would say that is the biggest benefit is, and this is something that I've really tried to sort of make a case for in the last several years, and I've written a couple of articles about it, but I really think that that one of the focal points of action research should be on the fact that it's really a mechanism for customizing professional development. So much of the professional development activities that we engage in the broad field of education tends to fall under this umbrella of a one-size-fits-all professional development. Someone puts together professional development programs and everyone attends them, or you pick and choose things that you might want to do from a list that's provided to you, and oftentimes that may not meet the professional growth and development needs of an individual educator. So action research as a process and as a mechanism for designing your own professional development is really, really a huge, and now we're back to that empowerment thing again, that you're really in charge of defining the things that you want to improve in your practice and doing so in a very systematic, very reflective manner. And if you put all of those things together, that's one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about action research for educational professionals, is because I think there are so many benefits that can be realized from a process that at the outset might be a little intimidating to people who are very novice when it comes to research and action research. But in the long run, after a few cycles of it, you get very familiar with the process. Then the outcomes far outweigh the costs and the potential frustrations that you might feel early on.
Okay. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about ethics in action research. So what are some characteristics of an ethical action researcher?
Well, ethics in action research to me is an ethics in research in general, especially in educational research. Much of the time we're collecting data from colleagues, fellow educators, or from our students who are children who are minors. And so we have to be cognizant of the fact that we are collecting data from those individuals. But I think with action research, the idea of ethics takes on an even greater role in terms of the importance that we have to follow in terms of being ethical researchers. And the reason I say that is because we need to remember the fact that this is not like more traditional educational research where a university professor or researcher or a graduate research assistant is going out into schools, collecting data, and then leaving. This is research where we are collecting data on our colleagues, on our students, on our administrators, on our processes, on our policies, and we don't leave. We stay there. So, after we've engaged in this process, we have to remember that we are once again going to be interacting with all of those entities, all of those individuals, all of those policies, everything else. So I think that being very careful in terms of how we approach action research in order to be as ethical as we possibly can. But I guess to me, action research ethics involves just a slightly deeper level of just having common sense in terms of how you approach the work with individuals who are participating in your action research. Simply because we have other relationships with these individuals that will go on during and after we complete cycles of action research. And I think that's very, very important for people to remember. I think it's one of the things that for decades that action research was criticized about not being as rigorous when it comes to things like ethics and so forth, because we're just collecting data on our students like we would any other day. But I would argue probably just the opposite of that,
Mm-hmm.
that we have to be more cognizant of that simply because, like I said before, we don't just collect those data and then walk out the door and never come back. We're there every day before, during, and after the action cycles of action research. So,
Right. I think it's an excellent point. All right, so the students in this class are practicing classroom teachers, and they, at the end of the 7 weeks, they have to actually develop an action research proposal to then go and do a project. And so part of what they do is they develop a problem statement and some research questions, and selecting a topic is very difficult for a lot of the students. So what kind of pitfalls would you recommend they try to avoid when selecting a topic?
well, the first thing I tell people is you want to make sure that your topic is not too narrow or too broad. And that's a very delicate balance. But usually, whenever I say that to students or to professional educators where I'm doing some sort of an action research workshop, the immediate follow up question is, well, how do we do that? And there's really not an easy answer to that. I think the biggest thing is that you have to try to balance what it is you're trying to find, what it is you're trying to find out, so that it's manageable for you, also factoring in those ethical issues. So one of the things that I do recommend that especially novice action researchers do is that if they have an idea for an action research study, for a problem statement, or for even sort of an umbrella context to their action research topic, is that they talk to colleagues about it.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest things that I've found is that oftentimes individuals will see things as problems, but their colleagues don't see them as problems. And so they go through this process of designing and implementing an action research study when there may not have been a problem to begin with, or the answer may have already been out there someplace, maybe in the classroom next door to them, that educator was, had solved and resolved years ago. And if they just shared and communicated, they could have had an answer much easier. So the idea that a problem is not always a problem until you really determine if it's a problem for others in your context, I think is very important. And I think sometimes even engaging in those conversations will help that process of either broadening or narrowing a topic. It's not just as simple as saying, well, if I need to broaden it, I just need to have more data. If I need to narrow it, I need to have fewer data, fewer sources of data. I don't think it's always as simple and straightforward as that. Sometimes it may simply be trying to define and describe and contextualize what you see as a problem and the extent to which it really may be a problem, and worthy of sort of taking the extra time that it's going to take to engage in action research. One of the other things that I talk to them about is the fact that they want to make sure that whatever they define as a problem or as a research question, that there are either available data or data that they could collect that would enable them to answer those questions. If they get into a process where they've sort of described a problem or a topic or a research question that they want to investigate without really trying to anticipate what that may look like down the road in terms of their action research, they may start the process and then get to a point where they figure out, I don't really know what kinds of data I would collect to answer that question. So those have to be some of those considerations that happen up front and in the early stages of planning. And I always advise educators that should, when you are trying to define your problem that you're trying to investigate, starting to consider what sources of data and what those data will look like needs to be some of the aspects of those preliminary decision-making processes. Otherwise, things may jump out at you when you don't want to find out later in the process. So that's something else in my notes here. I think the biggest thing is just really trying to determine the extent to which what you see as a problem is something that's a problem, and B, worthy of taking the time to investigate. This also gives educators a wonderful opportunity to perhaps collaborate on action research, because in having those informal conversations with colleagues, they may find out that one of their colleagues down the hall, or who teaches maybe in a different building but in the same district, experiences some similar but not quite the same problems, and then trying to collaborate on potential interventions or innovations that they could implement and then try to assess could be a very, very beneficial process.
So some of what you just shared might feed into this idea of talking to your colleagues. How important are critical friends to action researchers?
I think critical friends are really, really important. That's one of the reasons that I sort of brought it up in the conversation that we just had about defining topics and so forth, is because I think that, and again, these are things that professional educators have done for decades. We talk to our colleagues, we brainstorm, we run ideas past them, but we tend not to do it in a very systematic manner. And I think that once we begin to engage in an action research process where we are doing things that are much more systematic, then I think the concept of really identifying people to serve as our critical friends through this process is something that really can become invaluable. It gives you a set of eyes and ears that may be somewhat removed from your particular setting or context. That's why I think critical friends should also not just be limited necessarily to the person that teaches in the room next door to you. It may be an administrator in a different building that you've established a relationship with, or colleagues in a different building in a district. Or it could even be someone who you've networked with that doesn't even teach in your district, but maybe you met them at a conference and you've established a rapport with them and you stay in professional contact with them. Those individuals can be wonderful critical friends because I think that if you take the time to establish what a critical friend relationship really should look like, um, focusing on the critical part, but also the friend part. These people are not out to criticize and tear apart your ideas, but they want to give you things to think about. And I think that's just an absolutely invaluable part of the process, because if there are things that could be, adjusted in your ideas for an action research study, the time to do that is on the front end, not on the tail end. On the tail end, you may have spent a lot of time spinning your wheels and not necessarily making any progress. And you don't want to find that out after you've invested time and energy in that process. So doing those kinds of things early on, but then throughout the process, I think will really give professional educators a lot of valuable feedback in terms of their ideas for action research. But beyond that, it really just is an opportunity to develop and grow professional relationships that can extend even beyond the framework of action research studies.
So, you talked a little bit about this before, but how does action research function as professional development?
Well, I think it's ideal for professional development. I think that the idea that it can be both customizable makes it more meaningful to professional educators, simply because it gives them the opportunity to target what it is they want to focus on. And by doing that, it automatically becomes more meaningful because the results of action research studies are usable immediately by those individuals. It's not like more traditional educational research where we have to wait for results to be disseminated in a journal article or presented at a conference or in some other mechanism. So when you identify something that you want to work on and you collect data specifically to target that problem and you find out an answer to that problem, theoretically you can implement it tomorrow. You don't have to wait for anything else. You can do it very, very quickly and very, very efficiently. And I think that's a huge, huge piece. I've gotten to the point when talking about customizable professional development through action research processes that these things even be included and incorporated in annual goals. Most teachers and professional educators in our country, in most every district and school, at the beginning of the school year have to delineate 3 to 5 professional goals. What are you going to try to accomplish this year? Where are you going to try to improve? Well, roll that into an action research approach, and now you've got a mechanism for actually being able to address those goals that you've set out at the beginning of the school year. I would love to see that be actually part of teacher evaluation systems, where the goals and the results of the goals, the extent to which those goals were achieved or at least assessed, could be accomplished through an action research approach. So many teachers, when they develop those beginning of the year annual professional goals, they have ideas of what they want to do, but so often, unfortunately, an entire year will pass and they don't address those goals at all. And so action research, even if you're just doing it individually, will give you an opportunity to do that. But collaboratively with critical friends can give you an opportunity to really expand the potential impact that those action research studies as a mechanism for professional development can really have throughout your school or district.
All right, last question.
Okay.
What advice do you have for novice action researchers?
Well, the first piece of advice I would offer is to really embrace the process and what it can do for you. I think that initially, for a lot of people who are either unfamiliar with the research process and specifically action research, or are just intimidated by the thought of engaging in the process, it can be a little overwhelming
Uh-oh.
to embrace that process and where the potential lies. But then the second piece of advice that I give them that sort of goes along those lines is don't feel that you have to go big, at least right from the outset. Take something as an idea for action research that's very small, it's very manageable. Um, I tell people who are true novice action researchers to come up with one question that they want to try to answer, one question that maybe even has just one data source, and follow the process, engage in that process, try to come up with some conclusions, and then make a plan for where you want to go in the next cycle or for your practice. That gives you sort of an introduction and an initiation to the process as a whole. But then for subsequent cycles of action research, going through that process becomes easier and easier and easier. And then you can begin to expand, if you want, the scope of your action research studies. The last piece of advice that I really like to give to people, and some people don't like to hear this because they don't like this idea, but I tell them that it's okay to fail.
Mhm.
I tell them it's okay to be wrong. Because even in action research, if we, and I don't like the word fail because that does imply something very negative, but I will say be wrong. Because I think that when professional educators engage in an action research process and they find out that something that they had anticipated was wrong or it didn't work for them, they still learn from that process.
Mhm.
And I would argue that they've learned two things. One, they've learned something about themselves as professional educators and their ability to conduct and implement action research. So that's hugely important. But the second thing is they've learned something else about the context or the topic that they were investigating. They may have learned that whatever they tried didn't work. So if nothing else, they know they won't want to use that again because it didn't work for them. I mean, it can be that simple. So being wrong is not necessarily a bad thing because we still learn from being wrong. It's sometimes kind of a corny thing to say, but I really believe that. And I think action research lends itself very nicely to that concept of it's okay to be wrong. You still learn from being wrong, but provided you are willing to take what you learn and then move forward with the next cycle of action research and or the next thing that you want to do with your practice that you've learned from that. It could be that the focus of somebody's action research is not necessarily trying something new, but it's trying to further assess maybe the effectiveness of what they've been doing for years.
Mhm.
And they may find out that with some additional data, what they're doing works really well, or maybe not. But either way, they found something out that's going to inform and impact their practice from this present time moving forward. And I think that that is just hugely, hugely powerful. And I think if professional educators can embrace that idea and that concept, the potential for them as they begin this process, but certainly down the road as they become more comfortable with the process, I just think the benefits are limitless for them.
All right. Thank you so, so much. I really
You're very
appreciate
welcome.
it. I will send